I'm speaking with Professor Sean Moreland, editor of New Directions in Supernatural Horror Literature, The Critical Influence of H.P. Lovecraft. Thank you for speaking with me.
My pleasure, Chris. Thank you.
Tell me how you got into editing and working in this field.
Well, my PhD was done at the University of Ottawa. I completed it back in 2008, and at that time I was doing a lot of work on 18th and 19th century Gothic writers. In particular, for my doctorate, I was focused on two American Gothic writers, one of whom everybody has heard of, the other of whom far fewer people have, Charles Brockden Brown being the first and Edgar Allan Poe being the second. But I've had an interest in horror and Gothic fiction and film really since a very, very early age, so it was a kind of natural progression for me in terms of my research and teaching to deviate into that area.
So then tell me about this book.
So New Directions in Supernatural Horror Literature is an essay collection. It's got 12 chapters plus an introduction. Each chapter is written by a different contributor. All of the contributors are notable figures in terms of either the academic or scholarly side of studying horror, weird fiction, and the Gothic, or in terms of writing it. A number of the contributors are also very esteemed and important writers of weird fiction and horror, including Helen Marshall and Michael Sisko, notably. Each chapter, the whole book responds not so much to Lovecraft's fiction as to the legacy of his critical views, and focuses particularly on the essay, which was originally published in a semi-unfinished state, Supernatural Horror and Literature. So in 1927, it was published in an amateur journal called The Recluse, and Lovecraft continued to revise the essay during his later life. He did some extensive revisions in 1933 and 1934, and it was eventually posthumously published in its entirety by Arkham House, as was so much of Lovecraft's writing. And the book has really been in print since then, and it's had a tremendous influence on the course of horror literature and weird fiction through the late 20th century and into the 21st. And it's often acknowledged as, being a very crucial influence. But there hasn't really been a lot of sustained scholarly attention paid to that essay and to Lovecraft's critical influence in particular, as opposed to his fiction. So I contacted a number of colleagues and writers, scholars in the field whose work I admired about this project, and was met with a lot of enthusiasm. So I'm pretty excited by the lineup of contributors that we've got to the book, and I think each of the chapters really delves into areas of Lovecraft's critical views, his historical analysis, but also, his own aesthetic. The ideas that shaped Lovecraft's criticism, of course, also shaped his fiction. So some of the chapters in the book explore the intersection between those, looking at Lovecraft's fiction, whereas others really look at how his critical views have had an influence on other writers, including Stephen King, Caitlin R. Kiernan, Thomas Ligotti, and other forms of cultural expression in media, including games and film.
Now, I have to admit, I haven't read his critical theory book. Can you sort of give an idea of what he thought? What kind of themes you focus on as far as his? Yeah,
well, the book begins with the resounding and famous statement that the oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. So for Lovecraft, what he variously calls weird fiction, or the literature of supernatural horror, is focused on that particular emotion, and he grounds his discussion in contemporary 20th century psychology and a kind of awareness of the biological and evolutionary underpinnings of horror. One of the early chapters in the book, written by a Danish scholar named Matthias Clasen, looks at the psychobiological basis of Lovecraft's theory, and Clasen really argues very forcefully that in many ways Lovecraft's view of horror and the way that horror fiction works is very much in keeping with contemporary 21st century evolutionary psychological, studies of human nature and culture. Lovecraft goes on to produce a kind of, on the one hand, the essay is meant to be a kind of canonization of what he thought were the greatest works in the field. On the other, it's a historical survey. And the book tends to be strongest, most illuminating, and most forcefully written when it's talking about those writers whose work Lovecraft really responded to. So the section, for example, on 18th century Gothic fiction, he's drawing a lot from earlier criticism, Edith Burkhead's The Tale of Terror, and other critics of the Gothic. He doesn't have that much original to say about, the early Gothic period, although he is, for example, a very insightful commentator on Anne Radcliffe herself. He really locks on to some of the things that this 18th century Gothic novelist is able to do, and he makes some connections between what her work does back in the 18th century and what Poe does in the 19th. And for Lovecraft, Poe is really the hinge on which modern horror and weird fiction swings. He really sees all of the writers leading up to Poe as being, kind of precursor figures. They're working in the dark without a real awareness of the kind of psychological and aesthetic basis of the fiction they're writing. But when it comes to Poe, Lovecraft thinks, he was a great psychologist who really understood the kind of nature of horror and how it can best be expressed and explored through literary means. So in a certain sense, although he devotes the first few chapters to, early modern and 18th century examples of horror and the supernatural, it's really when he turns to Poe that the book really starts to take on a life of its own, and Lovecraft's knowledge and his enthusiasms really shine through.
So, I don't know how much of his correspondence has been preserved or other writings beyond his fiction. Is this his one work that deals with, critical theory, or does he have is there other documentation that these essays draw on?
Yeah, he wrote quite extensively on the subject, but supernatural horror in literature was his most ambitious treatment. I mean, it's ultimately a monograph. It grew to a very short book length in terms of its discussion, and it was obviously very important to Lovecraft because he continued to augment it and revise it through the course of his later life. As I said, it was first published in 1927, but he was continuing to revise it pretty intensely, especially up until 1934 and even thereafter. So it was important to him to kind of bring it up to date. S.T. Joshi's chapter in New Directions in Supernatural Horror particularly explores Lovecraft's changing critical views of the writers that he considered to be the titans of weird fiction. So those include Lord Dunsany, Walter Delamere, Blackwood, Machen, and so on. And Lovecraft really continued to rethink his own relationship with these writers and the kind of achievement that they managed to attain throughout the course of his later life. But he wrote other essays on supernatural horror, on weird fiction, etc., and his letters, his voluminous output of letters. I mean, Lovecraft was one of the most prolific letter writers of the 20th century, and a lot of his letters refer to horror fiction, the supernatural. He works out a lot of theories, a lot of ideas through his letters to other writers, some of which make it back into the revisions he makes to supernatural horror and literature later, others of which are incorporated in essays, including notes on weird fiction, some notes of a non-entity, and other essays that Lovecraft writes on the subject.
Mm-hmm. How did you set up what essays you wanted in the book? How much was that your choice? How much did it just kind of evolve organically, say?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it was definitely a little bit of both, because the prospective contributors that I approached, I knew of their work in sort of particular veins in particular areas. So one of the kind of main points of impetus for the project was a conference. I think it was back in 2015, the International Conference for the Fantastic in the Arts. We had a panel discussion or a paper session devoted to Lovecraft. And John Glover was among the presenters, Helen Marshall was among the presenters, Matthias Clausen was among the presenters, and their papers at this conference really kind of, reinforced for me the lack of a volume like this and the importance of putting one together. So I approached them specifically with the work that they presented at the conference in mind as areas of coverage that I thought would be ideally suited to a project like this. And then as I approached other prospective contributors, I sort of had in mind particular areas that I knew that they had done work in, that they were strong commentators on. Vivian Ralikas, another of the contributors, for example, has published what I think is to this day one of the best essays on Lovecraft's aesthetics and the relationship between cosmic horror and the aesthetics of the sublime. So I reached out to her to see if she would contribute a chapter to this. Gina Whisker has written a lot on feminist responses to and critiques of Lovecraft, so she was also a natural choice to write a chapter focusing in some way on that topic, on that subject area. And so it evolved a little bit with me suggesting a general topic area to the contributors, but then they each came up with an abstract and a more specific area on their own. And I think it comes together in a very complementary way. I'm quite happy with the kind of coverage that the book provides, that the 12 different chapters provide, and there's a really strong dialogue between many of the chapters. You know, there's a sense of complementarity there that I was really pleased with. But of course, with that said, Lovecraft's influence is complex, it's pervasive, it's problematic, and there's a lot of other things that could have been covered, that could have been touched on, which don't make it into this volume. Mm-hmm. Lots more work to do for scholars and critics and theorists and writers of weird fiction, supernatural fiction, and horror in those areas.
Okay. Before we move on, have you covered all sort of the themes that the book explores, or is there anything else you wanted to mention?
Well, I could just run through a list of the chapter titles, if that would be of interest, which gives a pretty strong sense of, the different focal points that the book takes.
Sure.
I mentioned my chapter, which is the first chapter in the volume, looks at the relationship between Lovecraft's conception of cosmic horror and this first-century Roman poet named Lucretius, who was a kind of classical atomist, a radical materialist poet that Lovecraft identified strongly with. He often cited himself as being in a line of materialist thinkers going back to the Greek philosopher Epicurus and the Roman poet Lucretius. And I argue that cosmic horror can best be understood as a kind of modernist mutation of Lucretius, of his idea of the atomic sublime, this kind of entropic picture of a material universe in which everything is just a very provisional amalgamation coming together of atomic components that are also constantly falling apart. This emphasis on transformation and perishability, that's such a signal part of Lovecraft's writing. The next chapter is Matthias Clausen's, and he argues, as I said, that Lovecraft's understanding of psychology is in many ways borne out by 21st century evolutionary psychological concerns. So he really goes into Lovecraft's ideas of fear and horror and what makes effective horror fiction with a contemporary psychobiological perspective. The third chapter is written by psychiatrist Sharon Packer, and it looks both at the history of psychoanalysis and Freudian psychology and Lovecraft's response to Jewish mysticism. Lovecraft was pretty notorious for his anti-Semitic views, but Packer points out he was also, at least to some degree, an insightful commentator on some Jewish supernatural traditions. He looks particularly at the play The Dybbuk by S. Ansky in supernatural horror literature. Then we've got Alyssa Berger, who explores in some detail the way that Stephen King has received and built on Lovecraft's ideas of horror. And King, of course, really helped to raise Lovecraft's popular profile in the 1980s. He recommended that readers of his nonfiction study of horror, Danse Macabre, seek out Lovecraft's essay. He kind of situates it as being one of the most important essays written on the history of horror fiction. Helen Marshall looks at how Lovecraft theories of horror can be applied to medieval literature. She notes that Lovecraft was hardly a medieval scholar. He was, not very strong on medieval history and culture, but his ideas of what constitutes, a horror story, his idea of cosmic horror, nonetheless has some useful bearings on medieval writings, and particularly the penitential poem, The Prick of Conscience. Vivian Rallikus looks at how Lovecraft draws on dandyism as a kind of artistic, aesthetic, and social movement, both in the 18th and 19th century, and how figures like Brummel and Oscar Wilde shaped Lovecraft's sense of himself, his own identity, and his approach to fiction. John Glover looks at how Lovecraft's ideas of horror and the weird have shaped subsequent criticism, how they've influenced the course of weird fiction through the late 20th and into the 21st century. But Glover also really looks at how, both for better and worse, the writers with whom Lovecraft was exchanging letters and ideas, how the ways that they took and spun his concepts, his mythology, and so on, have affected his later reception as a writer. S.T. Joshi, again, looks at Lovecraft's shifting analysis of some of the titans of weird fiction in the 20th century. Michael Sisko embarks on a really interesting philosophical speculation about the nature of the bizarre. He kind of looks at the bizarre as an experiential category, and he sees Lovecraft as opening this up as a possibility, rather than seeing it as something that's confined to the world of the literary, how it's something that we actually experience on a daily basis in a way. Gina Whisker takes a kind of feminist critical stance on reading Lovecraft's essay, but then goes on to focus on a number of later women writers who used Lovecraft's work to good effect and really have exploded some of the more misogynistic aspects of his fiction. She looks particularly at British writer Angela Carter, the American writer Caitlin R. Kiernan, and a really fantastic collection of short fiction that came out in 2015 called She Walks in Shadows, which was edited by Sylvia Moreno Garcia and Paula Stiles. And this, to your listeners, I can't recommend enough as a great example of the kind of multiplicity of approaches to Lovecraftian fiction that have been taken, and in this case, exclusively by women writers. Brian Hauser then takes some of Lovecraft's ideas about weird fiction and horror and applies them to 20th and 21st century film. He really uses Lovecraft's critical concepts to open up a paradigm within film studies that approaches the weird in a variety of ways. He talks about a number of films, including It Follows, as being in certain respects Lovecraftian. And finally, Brian Johnson looks at the way that Lovecraft's work was shaped by some of the homophobic social context of the early 20th century, how paranoia, panic, and weirdness are tied together in terms of their cultural construction through the 20th century, and how Lovecraft's work represents a kind of troubling example of the synthesis of a lot of these strands and ideas.
So I want to make sure I frame this question the right way. How do you research or edit a work like this? Do you just basically reread all of his work, this main book and all of his works? How do you, I know it's, a lot of it is informed opinion, but how do you go about making sure it's right? That what you read, it has a solid sort of factual foundation and theoretical foundation and all of that.
Yeah, so that's a good question, particularly because the contributors are often coming from very different approaches, from very different disciplinary backgrounds, and that varies from chapter to chapter, but each is grounded very closely in existing studies of Lovecraft's work, whether it's literary history and criticism, whether it's the massive body of text he left behind in the form of not only his essays, his fiction and critical writings, but especially of his letters, In the case of Clazen's chapter, for example, he's extremely up-to-date on contemporary evolutionary psychology and the kind of research that's been done into how horror fits within our evolved nature, as well as quite well read on, the Lovecraft's own writings and the criticism thereon. So it's a collaborative process in that each of the contributors to this volume is already a fairly established figure in the field of, weird fiction, horror, Gothic, or Lovecraft studies. But through a kind of back and forth as I was revising each of the chapters with them, I would often suggest other sources that they should look at, paradigms that they should think about. And in some cases, that was also true in converse. A contributor would recommend a source to me that I would then consult and recommend to another of the contributors. The volume then passed through a peer review process at Palgrave. So they brought on an anonymous expert in some of these areas to give some feedback, make some suggestions and recommendations on each of the chapters. At which point it was then sent back to the contributors, and each contributor and I, had another go at it, just making sure the arguments were as forcefully made as possible and the research was done to the best of our respective abilities. So, yeah.
So, did you have the opportunity or even need to look at any of his original papers, or is that pretty much all available, online or transcribed somewhere?
Yeah, that's a good question, too. Well, the Lovecraft archives are at the John Hayes Special Collection at Brown University Library in Providence, and they're actually in the process now of digitizing all of them. And I think most of them have been made available digitally through the library Special Collections portal. Although some of those papers, especially some of the letters, I think, have yet to be put up. I was actually in Providence last week doing some research on a different, although not entirely unrelated subject. I was looking at Caitlin R. Kiernan's archives for a paper on her run of the comic book The Dreaming back in the 90s, which was a Sandman, Neil Gaiman's Sandman spin-off. So I have consulted some of the Lovecraft archives there, although none of that really came into play in my chapter in this volume, and I don't think really any of the contributors in this volume used the unpublished work to any great extent in writing their chapters. But again, a lot of that stuff is being made available digitally through John Hayes Special Collections at this point. So I think in the next couple of years there'll be a resurgence of Lovecraft scholarship that's much more broad and detailed in its awareness of this kind of textual continuum of his writings, including his letters. I do a lot of work, a lot of research and writing on Edgar Allan Poe, and one of the major differences between writing on Poe and writing on Lovecraft is that in Poe's case, there remains a lot of room for speculation because we have a comparatively small body of his letters and other assorted writings available to us to flesh out, in terms of author biography and his personal history, his poetry, his fiction, and so on. But that's not the case with Lovecraft. Because of this huge body of epistolary writing he produced, these thousands and thousands of letters, it's something of a rabbit hole anytime you want to look into some aspect of Lovecraft's life and thought, because there's this tremendous body of, his personal writings and his letters that you can look to reinforce or to disprove a particular hypothesis or argument that you might be making about his work, his ideas, his critical views, and so on.
What part of working on this book was most enjoyable? Reading each of the chapters for the first time, having had an exchange via email and in some cases in conversation with each of the contributors, having some idea of what I was hoping that they would come up with, the direction that, I was hoping that their papers would take, and then seeing that not only realized, but in many cases just, completely gone beyond, having the kind of pleasure of having each of them open up these new apertures in appreciation or in understanding
of Lovecraft's critical views, both in terms of his achievement and in terms of his tremendous limitations and the kinds of consequences those limitations have had, given how influential supernatural horror and literature and his other critical writings have been through the 20th and into the 21st century. So definitely that, that sort of first rush of being introduced to these ideas, having them presented to me by each of the contributors for the first time.
What did you learn during this process that was most surprising? If anything.
Well, quite a bit, really. I guess that varies. In general terms, it's always amazing to me both how much there remains to be understood and how much can be drawn from and how much can be created from as well the work of a writer who has by this point been the subject of so much criticism, so much scholarly writing, so much both fictional and critical speculation as Lovecraft. But then on the other hand, there's also just a tremendous amount of work that goes into putting together a book of this sort. I always, having done a couple of edited collections before, I think I half forget how much is involved before I embark on another one. And I'm always struck again just by, how much needs to be done in terms of bringing these things together. As far as particular revelations from the chapters are concerned, I had really never thought much about the applicability of Lovecraft's ideas of horror to medieval writing, for example. I'm not a medievalist by specialization and training, so Helen Marshall's chapter really, I think, quite uniquely and powerfully opened up this field, this area of inquiry for me. Michael Sisko's chapter, I don't know if you've read any of Sisko's fiction, but he's one of the most fascinating weird writers writing in the 21st century, and his prose writing, his sort of more academic essays are really, in certain respects, just as strange and just as kind of fascinatingly unsettling as his fictions tend to be. So. But really, each of the chapters, contained something I had not thought about, really didn't have a grasp on before, despite having gone into this, having done previous work on research on Lovecraft. I found in each case, things were being brought to my attention, things were being illuminated that I had really never thought of before. So I could certainly point to something like that each chapter had brought to light for me.
Mm-hmm. Is there a particularly difficult question related to Lovecraft's thinking that you think was difficult to really get a grasp on during the production of this, or is there an issue that still exists that you'd like to see addressed, if that makes sense? Yeah,
really quite a few. I mean, one thing that springs to mind, the kind of politics of Lovecraft's reception and influence in terms of contemporary speculative fiction, contemporary horror. Of course, there is the whole, the debacle surrounding the World Fantasy Award, the so-called Howey Award in Lovecraft's image, the degree to which a widespread knowledge of the extent of Lovecraft's very virulent racism has really circulated in the 21st century. And those are things that I think, I've heard many people comment, well, yeah, so Lovecraft was a racist. You just kind of acknowledge that and admit that and move on. But there's a lot more to it than that. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of work remains to be done on, for example, how the kind of racial subtending of a lot of Lovecraft's thinking ties into other writers of the modernist period, for example, how it continues to serve as a kind of motivating factor for different social groups. There has been a tendency amongst some very xenophobic conservative thinkers to rally around Lovecraft partially because of that aspect of his writing, whereas that's also posed something of a problem for Lovecraft fans, enthusiasts, and to some degree scholars who, recognize the importance of Lovecraft's writing and his critical ideas, and wrestle to somehow integrate that with some of the racial and social viewpoints that he espoused, or some of the misogyny that that sometimes comes through in his work.
Mm-hmm.
But Lovecraft was a really interesting writer on a wide variety of phenomena. So something else that, there just remains a lot to be explored is the way in which his knowledge of contemporary philosophical issues, his engagement with Einstein's writings and the special and general theory of relativity are relevant to the kinds of fiction that he ends up writing. His ideas about the weird, his ideas about horror and supernaturalism. Really, there are so many areas on which Lovecraft's thought and writing touch. I think that's part of what has made him a continuously resonant writer, even for people coming to him in the 21st century for the first time. A kind of, uncannily untimely contemporary aspect to his thought, to his writing, but also, an aspect that's extremely retrogressive and highly antiquated.
Mm-hmm. You bring up a point that I've always thought, and maybe my thinking is superficial. But it's always been interesting that if some of his horror stems from his racism, like literally a fear of that which he doesn't know and is not part of his culture, if fear and horror can stem from that, it makes you wonder and question, where does current horror come from? From what well does it spring? What is it you actually fear? If you see what I'm saying.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of just the fundamental fear of difference, right? The unknown is always closely linked to anything which is different from oneself, from how you see or how you identify yourself, how you perceive yourself. So horror is always tied up with alterity, right? With difference, as much on a kind of social and cultural register as on, a metaphysical cosmic register, which is the ultimate emphasis that Lovecraft's late fictions in particular focus on. So Stephen King commented, and this also is in Danse Macabre, it was published in 1981, autobiographical essay on horror, that horror writers are like the Republican banker in a three-piece suit, in that they're constantly exploiting common fears in order to make a buck, right, in order to gain some kind of power or some kind of privilege. And, there's a sense in which Lovecraft's fiction, the intersection of his more cosmic and metaphysical anxieties and his very xenophobic tendencies, is one of the more dramatic examples of the truth of that statement.
Mm-hmm. So, was there anything that you discovered that emotionally moved you? I don't know if that's possible, with such academic research, but perhaps there is.
Yeah, well, I find reading Lovecraft's letters in general to be a really, really unsettling, but sometimes fairly emotional experience. And in part it's because of, the juxtaposition of tremendously incisive, insightful and articulate thought on very complex topics and issues. And then, you dive from that into, writing about his experiences in New York, the kind of mixed race polyglot of languages he sees around him, and he imagines that a capsule of cyanide gas is the only solution for this. You go from this kind of, complexity, this kind of richness of thought, to this absolutely vicious and virulent kind of phobic sensibility, often on a dime. So that's one of the more unsettling things about really working with Lovecraft's writings a lot, reading his letters in particular. For me, one of the most touching things I've ever read by Lovecraft is in a 1937 letter he wrote to a man named Niels Fromm, and at that point Lovecraft he died of intestinal cancer, complications related from intestinal cancer, and he would have been in at least the early stages of that at that point. And it's just a meditation on the foolishness of desiring immortality. He says, in effect, what is immortality that human beings should even want it? We are these perishable assemblages of material like everything else. But there's no need to despair there. We should, because of that, precisely because of our recognition of that, take as much pleasure as we can in intellectual pursuits and the appreciation of art. And after all, we are more complex than than any other form of energy transformation and exchange that comes within our purview. There's a certain kind of grandeur, there's a certain kind of sublimity, for lack of a better word, in that view. And it's that aspect of wonder that Lovecraft sometimes captures that I think makes his work compelling enough that despite all of the really deeply troubling or problematic, or in some cases some of the more hackneyed aspects of it, that gives it this kind of enduring resonance and appeal.
What do you hope, beyond a fuller understanding of Lovecraft, what do you hope this book will do?
I think for anybody interested in horror, Gothic fiction, weird fiction in the 20th century and beyond into the 21st, the book will, illuminate a lot of things about those areas. For those who aren't necessarily as invested in those subjects, though, it's also, to some degree at least, a work of cultural history, and a work of popular philosophy. Different chapters sort of break down, differently in different directions there. But I think in terms of the general reader with an interest in, for example, literary history, in the way that philosophy links into to popular fiction, I think the book will have some appeal. I think it will have some strength. And of course, I hope that it continues to generate, more discussion, more debate, more research in terms of Lovecraft's thought, in terms of his critical writing, in terms of his fiction. But perhaps even more importantly, I hope it leads to further discussion of some of the other writers and thinkers that get woven into, integrated, analyzed in terms of Lovecraft's influence and his critical concepts. So again, Caitlin Kiernan and Thomas Ligotti, Stephen King, the way in which the weird has become such a quintessential part of contemporary 21st century film, even outside of the horror genre, something that Brian Hauser's essay touches on. That's something that I really hope is further explored by other writers in the near future. So, the hope is that the book will trigger and feed into some of these very different discussions.
So this question may seem a little odd, and I think we sort of touched on it, but if someone doesn't know Lovecraft and reads this book, what kind of person would they come away thinking he was?
I think somebody who comes to this book without much prior knowledge of Lovecraft would have an impression of a tremendously complex and contradictory thinker and writer, and I think that's to some degree a fair assessment. My mother read my introductory essay about a month and a half ago, and her comment was, Lovecraft was kind of a racist, wasn't he? And that was just something she apparently, she didn't realize. She hadn't really read or thought much about Lovecraft's views. But that's become increasingly the thing that people who don't have a tremendous knowledge of Lovecraft's, fiction, critical views, etc., have started to associate him with. And I think the book also offers up other apertures of his thought and his writing than, well, he was a racist guy who wrote horror fiction, or, he was a horror writer who also held these troubling social views, racial views, and so on. Mm-hmm. So I think that, I think that the book is going to appeal more to those who already have at least sort of a general knowledge of and interest in Lovecraft. It would be a pretty steep starting place for, an average reader who's never read one of Lovecraft's stories, for example, or who doesn't have much interest in weird fiction or in horror.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Can you speak to any difficulties you had in getting, in finishing the book or getting it published? Were there any, if any, and how you overcame those?
Not so much in getting it published. In this case, I'd sent a proposal to Palgrave at a pretty early point in the project. I think I gathered abstracts from the contributors, sent it in. They were very interested. The problem was more in actually bringing it all together and getting it done. This kind of work really doesn't, it's not remunerative. It doesn't pay, and it also, it's something that, probably like your podcasts, I wedge in between teaching courses at university, doing other forms of writing, doing paid editing, that kind of thing. So, it takes me a while to really bring this amount of material together and push it forward. And of course, it takes the contributors a considerable amount of time to write their chapters. And then from, when the first abstracts are submitted to when the first revised draft of the book has come out, it's more than a year and a half has elapsed. And at that point, there's sort of what needs to be added, what needs to be integrated, what needs to be caught up on in the downtime. So getting it published really was not a problem, but of course, bringing it all together and getting it to a point of completion is always, with a project like this, a challenge.
So do you have a next project in mind?
I've got a few things that I'm working on. I'm slowly working away on a monograph, on a book that I've just been thinking about, been ruminating over for a couple of years now, but I'm quite a ways from finishing it. The tentative title would be, Repulsive Influences, a history of atomic horror, where I'll look at the ways in which the evolution of horror literature from the early modern period and the Gothic period intersects with the reception of Lucretius's poem De Rerum Natura, and this kind of atomistic and materialistic philosophy shaping a lot of cultural debates and popular anxieties about the nature of material and the nature of mortality. But yeah, that's a kind of long-range project. I'm working on an essay collection that I'm editing focused on Charles Beaumont, who's probably best remembered as one of the chief writers for the original Twilight Zone series, Rod Serling's Twilight Zone. But it was also a tremendously accomplished short story writer and novelist, screenwriter, etc. So slowly putting together an essay collection by multiple contributors on that. That's all that springs to mind right now, though.
I guess this book will be available online. I guess Amazon will have it. And is there any place online people can find your writings or thoughts? Do you have a website, social media?
Yeah, I have a website where I blog occasionally, write reviews, do author features, post interviews with authors, called Postscripts to Darkness. That's at www.pstdarkness.com. You can find, if you go to my profile there are links to some of the short fiction I've published over the years, poetry I've published over the years, as well as other essays, some of which are available online. Unfortunately, most of my academic writing is, behind a paywall or in an essay collection, something like that. But you can find links to those which are available if you look at my profile on Postscripts to Darkness.
Okay. That's all the questions I have. Do you have any final thoughts?
No, I don't think so. Those were really, intriguing and generative questions, so thank you very much for that.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to visit chrisalvarez.com or theartofsciencefiction.com for more great interviews, photos, and articles. Your visits help support this podcast. Please remember that my first name, Chris, does not have an H in it. One of the best ways to provide feedback for this podcast is to rate me on iTunes. Please give me a good rating if you liked it, or feel free to give me a bad rating if you didn't. I'll use that feedback to make this a better podcast. You can also follow me on Instagram under Chris Alvarez Sci-Fi, on Facebook under Chris Alvarez WLC, on YouTube under Chris Alvarez WLC, and on Twitter under Chris Alvarez WLC. Thanks for listening, and keep imagining the future.